In this context, it was the Soviets that threatened. The Cold War had now entered a new, more dangerous phase when Nikita Khrushchev issued the 1958 ultimatum on the status of Berlin, challenging the U.S. extended deterrent.
2.8 million refugees that had left Eastern Germany for West Germany since 1945. That left a country of only 17 million people in East Germany, and it was 2.8 million of the best and brightest of the country.
When the Berlin crisis happens, everybody wants to gear up our conventional forces so that maybe we can have a conventional battle against the Soviets. The president says, we're not doing that, because that could turn into a nuclear war. You can't control that. Eisenhower's all alone. He says, we're doing this because if we do this, it's all or nothing. He used a poker analogy in the National Security meeting. He said, we're not going to slowly escalate from the white chips conventional forces to the blue chips nuclear weapons. If we do this, we're going all the way. It's all or nothing.
Eisenhower would probably have used nuclear weapons in defense of Western Europe. As Herman Kahn once eloquently put it, Kennedy said that he would use nuclear weapons, but he wouldn't, whereas Eisenhower said he wouldn't use nuclear weapons, and he would have.
Eisenhower believed that you had to plausibly threaten to cross the nuclear threshold in order to prevent the Soviets and East Germans from presenting a conventional war challenge to the integrity of Berlin. And for the Kennedy administration, they were much more concerned about having to fight an actual war with the Soviet Union. They were much less confident in their ability to deter that war.
In Khrushchev's view, the credibility of the extended U.S. deterrent starts eroding with the election of Kennedy. He knows from his intelligence that Kennedy is much less comfortable with the notion of risking millions of U.S. lives over the future of Berlin. As far as Kennedy's concerned, he's been handed a set of nuclear options that he thinks gives him a choice of, quote, Holocaust or humiliation.
I think that Khrushchev, at the Vienna summit, had concluded that the new president was weak, and therefore he engaged in this kind of bombast.
Khrushchev came in pushing hard, demanding, being somewhat threatening, insisting that something had to be done about the Berlin situation. And the president had tried to be conciliatory, to suggest, well, we should talk, we should be careful about how dangerous the situation could be, and so on.
That led to the feeling that Kennedy was having a loss of face, that he wasn't being treated with respect and credibility by the Soviet Union.
This was part of the difficulty of worrying about credibility, was that you didn't know what would be crucial in affecting other people's estimate of it.
If you think about deterrence in general, credible deterrence is really both a function of capability and will as perceived by your adversary.
The real key is whether the other side believes that the leader has the will to use nuclear weapons in extremis.
Deterrence depends upon the perception that it will be used, and most importantly, not the perception of our possible foes, but on those whom we seek to protect.
Climax of the president's European trip takes place in London.
Kennedy left Vienna, deeply troubled by his meeting with Khrushchev. The Soviet premier had effectively threatened the young president with war if the matter of Berlin was left unresolved.
The president wanted to be tougher on Berlin, so he escalated the Berlin military situation by sending more troops to Europe. He about Berlin.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
East German troops swooped down on the border between Red Berlin and the Free City in the pre-dawn hours to close the 66 points where movement between the sectors...
And for the first 48 hours, it's not a wall. It's barbed wire, it's sawhorses, it's temporary barriers as they wait to see how the U.S. and the Allies will respond. And when the East Germans, the Soviets, see that the U.S. is not responding, they start building a more permanent barrier.
The crisis was diffused because Khrushchev built a wall. But I think there was a lingering effect that Khrushchev was sort of dubious, and he thought that Kennedy was weak.
What made the situation dangerous in 1961 and then 1962 isn't our capability, that was pretty clear, but it was our adversaries' understanding that we were unwilling to use it in situations they were willing to risk.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. A series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Some argue that Khrushchev's challenge to extended deterrence in Berlin spilled over into a crisis that would test the credibility of the basic deterrent of the United States.
There would have been no Cuban Missile Crisis had Khrushchev not concluded through Berlin in 1961 that he could risk putting nuclear weapons for the first time in history within reach of Washington, D.C. and New York City, just off the coast of Florida.
Kennedy was humiliated in 1961 at the Vienna meeting. He was pushed around by Khrushchev, so he had to look extra tough by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But one of the things that made Kennedy a good president, although he talked tough, he was also a realist. By talking tough, but actually by being willing to make a deal. We traded away, the United States traded away its missiles in Europe for the Soviet missiles in Cuba.
So Khrushchev was willing to sort of try to take more chips off the poker table, say over Berlin, to some extent over Cuba. But ultimately, he was not willing to go into war because I think Khrushchev understood very well that the U.S. nuclear deterrent fundamentally was credible.
Kennedy restored that credibility, but not before reaching the brink of war.
Both Khrushchev and Kennedy understood that important mistakes had been made, glitches had shown up, things had been done that they didn't want to see done. The Navy was busy trying to force Soviet subs to surface.
But the missile crisis in October 1962 was a terrifying event, especially if you're the supreme decision maker whose hand is on the button. I don't think Kennedy slept much during those 13 days.
The mere fact that the consequences of nuclear use are so horrendous is what makes leaders, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, incredibly cautious in crises.
Khrushchev came away from the crisis with a guarantee of Cuban sovereignty, but his challenge of the U.S. nuclear deterrent was a miscalculation that almost led to war and ended his leadership of the Soviet Union. Kennedy discovered that establishing and maintaining a credible extended deterrent was a highly nuanced challenge, one that remains so to this day.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The Cold War ended unexpectedly 30 years after the Cuban crisis. Those decades were a time of arms racing, arms control, and a codification of nuclear deterrence between the superpowers. In 1991, many predicted that in a new world order, the role of nuclear weapons would recede. But since then, some have argued that a second nuclear age is emerging, where nuclear weapons remain a persistent reality.
President Bush said, nobody won, nobody lost the Cold War. Everybody won, because this war was over without a shot being fired peacefully. Great.
When the Soviet Union broke up, there was a very brief period of euphoria.
I think the Russians believed if they just got all this communist control stuff out of the way and they just removed all the obstacles to a dynamic, vibrant, free enterprise, capitalistic system, that it would emerge.
The Russians understood they were in trouble, but they didn't understand how much trouble they were in.
What you had basically in all of the countries that emerged from the Soviet Union, including Russia, was they went into economic freefall.
Suddenly, they were all starving. And they were disrespected. They didn't have any influence on the international scene.
What lessons does a state like Iran take from this experience?
One of the things that I think we learned during the start of the Cold War is that new nuclear weapon states got the weapons for a reason. They believe the weapons will not only have military utility, they will have political utility. And in the case of a government like Iran, it will be probing and testing for where its weapons might give it broader latitude of action even than it takes now.
They look around and they see the Pakistanis having nuclear weapons to their east. They see the Russians having them to the north. They see the U.S. and others having them to the south and the west. And they basically say, we're surrounded by nuclear powers. I think that Iran looks at how easily the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, who had no nuclear weapons, how easily Gaddafi was taken out by a ragtag rebel army and Western air support, but how careful we are in how we deal with the North Koreans.
Now, even if security is the main incentive, the main motivation for Tehran's nuclear weapons program, that doesn't mean that Tehran's leaders, should they acquire nuclear weapons, would only behave in a defensive, deterrent mode.
So you can imagine an Iran that has nuclear weapons that then is emboldened in a way similar to Pakistan.
What do you do if they intensify their transfer of weapons to Hezbollah and others and allow their nuclear force to be used as an offensive deterrent?
The political decision to build the bomb has not yet been made in Iran. So the first question that should be asked in Iran, how can we deter them from making that decision?
Military strikes might set the program back a few years, but at the end of the day, military strikes will also unite an Iranian public which is divided over whether or not Iran should have a nuclear weapon behind a nuclear weapons program, and it will also destroy any hope, to the degree that slim hope exists, that there will be political change within Iran.
A war with Iran would have very serious implications, but just as serious would be Iran getting nuclear weapons. We are not going to get an absolute total guarantee. No country would be able to do that, but we have to have a verifiable way of knowing that we will be able to have early enough warning for the Iranians, if they are going to go forward with a weapon quest, that we will be able to take action to stop it.
We don't yet know whether Iran actually perceives a more secure future in having a nuclear weapon. We know that they perceive a benefit in moving in that direction, but actually having one, well, we'll find out.